Laurence, you were there. I would love for you to take us through a timeline as you knew it, as you were hearing from the FIA, penalty, no penalty, what's going to happen. We obviously watched Fernando Alonso make it to his second podium of the season, 100th podium of his career, and then everything started chaotically unraveling. How did it play out from your standpoint?
Yeah, so let's go from the very start, which actually happened at the start of the race. Fernando Alonso was out of his pit box. He was to the left of his pit box. And under a regulation which has changed this year, you have to be within the pit box. You have to have your two front tyres within those lines. And he didn't. So he incurred a 5-second penalty, which is exactly what happened to Esteban Ocon in Bahrain. He went to serve the 5-second penalty. And in F1, if you're taking a pit stop, you serve the 5 seconds at the start of that pit stop. The team are not allowed to work on the car, but this was exactly what became the issue later on. What constitutes working on a car? And in this case, Aston Martin had the rear jack fitted to the car as it came in within that 5 seconds. And that's what created some confusion later. Actually, the FIA and its remote operations center in Geneva looked at the initial pit stop, decided it was okay. And then it was only on the final lap that they decided, oh, actually, we've seen some different camera angles and we need to look into this again. So they flagged it along with the race director, or they flagged it to the race director and the FIA's new sporting director, a guy called Steve Nielsen, who's just moved from F1 to the FIA. And they said, stewards, you need to have a look at this. Potentially there was a breach of how this 5-second penalty was served. And the stewards looked into it. They agreed that the jack was touching the car and therefore it was a penalty. The only problem is that whether touching the car means working on it. And that's basically what happened, what kind of we got stuck into a little bit later on. So the stewards issued a 10-second penalty for touching the car with a jack. That basically meant that Fernando Alonso was taken off the podium, even though he'd already gone and lifted the trophy on the podium. And then we waited until it was about 1 o'clock. I was just about to board my my transfer to the airport, knowing that this was all being investigated. And finally, the FIA came back with a statement saying that, oh, actually, Aston Martin have come to us. They've requested a review because they've given us 7 examples of jacks touching cars at 5-second or 10-second penalties in the pit lane. And they've also questioned whether the teams had agreed collectively that touching the car with a jack constituted working on it, and whether that was the front jack or the rear jack. And it all got very complicated. And in the end, as I was just arriving at the airport, I found out that Fernando Alonso was back on the podium. So, I mean, that's, it's ridiculous going through that now, isn't it? Trying to explain that in one simple go. But that's essentially what happened. And that's where we got to. But I think it opened up a lot of questions. For me, there's 2 big ones. One is the remote operations center was brought in to make things simpler. It was brought in to kind of investigate these things so the stewards don't have to be constantly doing too many jobs at once. And they didn't seem to catch it the first time. And if they did, they didn't fully understand what that meant. And and then it was this agreement at the Sporting Advisory Committee that some teams felt that touching a car with a jack was working on it, others didn't, and not having clarity on that. So we basically had, as is so often the case in F1, a rule that is open to interpretation, and the stewards interpreted it one way initially, and then the team that got the penalty, Aston Martin, came back and interpreted it a different way, and ultimately that was considered the right way. So it's just messy, isn't it? But this is not uncommon in Formula One. This seems to happen quite a lot. The rules that are open to interpretation create these kind of arguments. Anyway, I'll let someone else talk now because I feel like
thank you for the timeline.
That was comprehensive. I mean, I don't think you're going to get a better description of that. I do find it, I mean, just to follow on from that, the most bizarre thing from Formula One's perspective, and I've always thought this is weird, is why do they do the podium ceremony before the official result is out? I feel like, I understand why that kind of traditionally has been the case. But the more you look at it now, the more you're just like, just get the stewards thing out of the way. And I mean, if you are gonna, if you do want to say, well, it's not great for the show, make the stewards bit part of the show. Put a camera in the stewards room. You don't have to play sound, but show the driver in there or show the team rep in there talking to the stewards. I watched the Cheltenham horse race was last week. It's like a week long. It's a bit like the Kentucky Derby, Katie. Just a week of just horse racing all day, and people just probably losing lots of money on bets. But at one point there was this contentious decision where one of the jockeys had to go and see the stewards, and they had a camera in there, and you could see him talking, and it was a bit animated. And I was thinking, this is great. I'd never seen this before. They didn't play it, so you couldn't hear what he was saying. But it was good as well because they said until we know what happens here, we can't actually tell you what the result is. And as a fan watching on TV, like 99% of people will be watching a Formula One race. More than that, that's key, isn't it? You want to finish the broadcast knowing who has finished first, who's finished second, who's finished third. I texted a friend about an hour after the race. I was like, "Oh, did you?" Because he's a big Aston Martin fan, and I said, "Oh, sorry, Alonso lost the penalty, mate. Lost the podium, mate." And he's like, "What? What do you mean?" I was like, "Oh, he's been docked 10 seconds," and he had no idea because he'd switched off towards the end. Once the race had finished, and he'd gone about. He didn't have alerts on his phone or anything like that. And then about an hour later, I messaged him. I was like, "Sorry, Alonso's actually back on the podium." And
Just kidding.
What on earth? And it's just so it's so avoidable. I think that it's difficult because there's obviously processes that have to be followed here, and the FIA is very good at going. They go through processes and say this has to happen, this has to happen, this has to happen. But to have the podium ceremony when one of the guys on there is under investigation, it just seems very, very dumb. And I think that is the most obvious way around this, isn't it? Is you say if you finish, you go straight to the stewards. You just do that, and the stewards prioritize whoever's on the podium first, because ultimately that's what fans want to see, don't they? They want to know who the top three are. So that's an obvious fix, I guess. But the rest of it, I don't know. Maybe I'll now throw a hospital pass, as we used to say in rugby, over to Toni to see how to fix the rest of it.
You want me to help with solutions, Nate? Thanks for that one. No, I will say there's something that's really interesting for me, and it's just that we started this year with all the regulatory changes around what drivers can and can't say. And I had this moment of, oh, this is going to be the most political year we're ever going to see in Formula One, because when you tell people you can't do something, all of a sudden, like all of that comes up. And I think it's similar. The similar thing is happening right now with how decisions are taken with the stewards as well, is just there's a massive lack of inconsistency. And one of the reasons, obviously, we have these rotating stewards is is to try and avoid bias. But that also lack of inconsistency means that we're getting inconsistent decisions left, right, and center. And the other thing that it took me a while to realize, which was the stewards have access to hundreds of camera angles, live data, radio messages that we don't actually always hear or understand. So I liked your point also, Nate, of what would it look like if we could actually get a better understanding of what is actually going on and what information the stewards are looking at. And I know that's maybe asking for too much as a fan, but to your point, there is something here of we don't know how the decisions are made. So for me, there's like a lack of consistency and there's a lack of clarity, which just muddles the whole thing even further. But I think it was Zach Brown last year also that came up with, or that spoke about this pretty openly, that these steward positions are not permanent, which means they're unpaid, and it might be time to have a look and actually change this to have these steward positions actually all be permanent and paid. So we had to maybe potentially allow for that consistency, because I think it's getting to a point where it's a little bit ridiculous. To your point, Nate, of your friend, most fans are a casual fan, that they tune in, they watch the race, they want to be able to tune out and then enjoy the rest of their weekend without having to stay constantly, online and figuring out what all those changes are. And I think we have to solve that, because not all of us want to spend every waking moment thinking about all the changes and back and forths when it comes to a podium win.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. And for more sports highlights and analysis, be sure to download the ESPN app. And for premium content plus live streaming, make sure to subscribe to ESPN Player.